Welcome to So Very Easy. My name is Laura, and it's always fun to start the new year off with a new apron and matching placemats. And I have a very simple panel that's going to make this very quick so I can get it done right in time for my new year. This fabric is from Northcott, and it has two panels. One panel will make us an apron. So it has the shape of the apron, and at the bottom it does have the straps. But it also has a panel that makes placemats. So if we wanted 6 placemats or more, we just would buy more fabric. And of course, we can always get beautiful coordinates. So the first thing I'm going to do is make that apron, and I'm going to show you my quick way of turning that apron panel into the apron. Because I will be washing this apron, I do like to wash the fabric first. And by washing the fabric, it also helps put it back into a natural state. So I washed the fabric in warm water, put it in the dryer for a couple of minutes, took it out, and pressed. I will be making this apron lined, and that's what makes it go together very quickly. So I'll separate my ties from my apron. I will be cutting a 1/4 inch from this bottom line. So I could take that ruler, my rotary cutter, and cut that panel off. I will not be cutting out the apron until after, but I will be needing to make the ties that are going to go around the neck and around the waist. So we have those 4 ties. Cut right down the middle in between all of these lines. So we're going to have a little bit of white on each edge. I find it really simple just to cut those apart with scissors. I will need to trim off the selvage, so I'm going to leave just a little bit of a seam allowance, maybe 1/8 of an inch. And on that other piece, same thing. Cut off a little bit, so I only have 1/8 of an inch. If you want, you could cut right to the edges, but I want to keep these as wide as possible. And trim off the ends. All the way around that print, I'm going to have a tiny little seam allowance. No more than 1/4 inch, closer to 1/8 of an inch. And all of these ties are going to be stitched the same way. I'm going to fold those in half, and I need to stitch all the way down one side and then come up and close that second side. And that little extra white will be left in the seam allowance, so we won't see it. Once we have this piece stitched, we need to turn this right side out. Now there are tube turners and things that we can get to turn this right side out. But if you don't have one of those, you can do this with something like a chopstick. The first thing we want to do is cut off those little corners. That's just going to give us less bulk, and those corners are going to be a lot more pointy versus round. Just don't cut into the seam allowance. And then separate that fabric. Pull the fabric apart. We want to push this end through the tube. So start with the little end apart, and then just make a little dimple so this looks like it's going to start going in. From here, we can then push that through the tube. If you have a chopstick, you can start with that point just to get those corners going, but use the flat end of the chopstick because that point will poke through your fabric. And then we're going to want to gently pull that fabric up and over. So I can take that chopstick and hold it against myself. And that just sort of gives me an extra helping hand. So I'm kind of pushing it against, and at the same time, just starting to wiggle that fabric through. Once we get it started, it's not too bad. So I'm just pushing this right up against me and just pushing that fabric through. But if the point is in there, it can poke through the fabric. And before I take this out, I loosen it up and I poke my corners. Take whatever you're using out. So I have that one end flat. And as I pull it out, I'm just going to straighten up that fabric, little at a time. So in a sense, I'm finger pressing, but I'm taking time to line that up straight. You just do this a little at a time. you might need to wet the end of your fingers to roll that fabric. Just rolling that until I get right to the end. I now have that flat tube with the seam on the one side. Now I can go to the iron and press that flat. And we will need to do that to all 4 of those strips. The 4 ties are done. I can now attach them onto this apron panel. Now we can cut out this apron shape first, or we can do it after. I'm going to choose to do it after. Take the edges that we did not fold over, and we do have some areas marked that the ties are going to go on. We have the waist and the neck, but we do need to leave them come over about 1/4 of an inch. So that tie needs to go down 1/4 inch from that top. So as I'm stitching, I'm going to stitch over this tie and then turn and go up. So that space will be taken in by seam allowance. We will need to do that for the sides and this top. Have the pin heads come out, that way we can remove them as we're stitching around. I will take these ties and pin them out of the way because I do not want to stitch them inside. And it won't matter where you pin them, we just want to pin them out of the way. Because I'm putting 2 layers of fabric together, it's important that our fabric is very well pressed. We want both the fabrics pressed, and that way they're not going to distort after it's been stitched together. From that wrong side of fabric, I can see that cutting line, and that's why I'm not going to cut it out first. I now can pin it on top of another piece of fabric, but be sure your fabric is pressed. I have both those fabrics, so right sides are touching, and smooth those layers out so they're all equal. Now I can pin the inside of this pattern. I will not be pinning close to the seam allowance. I'm going to pin within, and that way I don't have to remove the pins until after I finish stitching. I do not want to run over the pins. I just want them to hold my layers down. So the pins are 1 inch away from those edges. Now we can transfer those pins that are holding those ties on. If you sandwich these layers together, you can use this cutting line as a stitching line. We just need to make sure that we have enough of those ties that are going to get caught in that seam allowance. We can now take this to the sewing machine and sew it. If you're going to use that outside line as a stitching line, we're going to be able to stitch on that line. If not, you're going to stitch in 1/4 inch, and you're going to stitch all the way around, leaving an opening on one of the sides. And I would recommend an opening about the size of your hand. And in order for me not to forget, I double pin. So I will put 2 pins where I want to stop and 2 pins where I want to start. So I now can stitch all the way around and stop. And if we come across the pin that we're going to run over, be sure to take it out. Once this is all stitched, I'm going to be able to trim off all of this extra. You can use a rotary cutter, scissors, but I'm going to be using pinking shears. As I'm trimming, I will trim off these points. Just like those ties, it's going to leave a nice finish when we do turn it right side out. Now I'm going to be able to turn this right side out. And be careful of those pins holding on those straps. Now we can press and make sure that those edges are matching up. We can now close up this opening. I do like to top stitch my aprons. I find they wash really nice and they stay looking nice after the wash. So we can do a row of top stitch all the way around, and you can also top stitch those ties. Now we can work on our placemats. Because these placemats are on a panel where we can buy as many as we would like, we could sandwich these together just like we would do a regular quilt and then cut them apart and bind them. So it'd be like we're quilting an entire quilt and then cutting that quilt apart. But we can also do them in a pillowcase method, which means we're going to have to cut these apart. So I'm going to be able to cut them apart right on the lines indicated. And be sure to cut off that selvage. I will now need the backing fabric cut the same size. And I use this right as that pattern. Make sure your fabrics are pressed and then cut out so they're exactly the same size. And I did make sure that the fabric on the back is the way I would like it to be when the placemat is done. Now I can put on my batting. Keep those fabrics together. You can place the batting on the back or the front. Take that batting underneath and just give it a slight tug so we know that all of the wrinkles and folds are out, because we do want all of these layers flat. And pin those 3 layers together. Once these layers are pinned together, we're going to sew all the way around, leaving an opening. So we can mark with the double pins where we're going to stop and start. I'm going to round the corners. So I'm going to take a spool of thread, and it won't matter which one, put it in the corner and draw around that curve. That line will be a cutting line. So I'm going to be able to use the edge of the fabric with my sewing machine foot. So we're just going to lift up this fabric and trim off the batting. I do want to trim that batting off as close as I can to the stitching line and trim off that little corner. We're going to be able to turn this right side out and go between the 2 layers of fabric. If we go between the batting and the fabric, the batting will be on the outside. So just go between those 2 layers. Now press all of those seams so that the seams are right along the outside. And this is one time where pressing, which means we're putting the iron up and down, is a lot better than ironing. We do not want to stretch these layers. We do want them to remain the same. And sometimes that motion will stretch them. So press going up and down, making sure all of those seams are flat. The little opening will now need to be closed. I would recommend a row of top stitch all the way around and then quilt it however you'd like it. And the placemat is done. It is 2-sided and we did not have to do any hand binding. I now have a new apron to start my year and matching placemats. And thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. And I'd like to take this opportunity to wish you and all of those that are dear to you a wonderful and beautiful new year. Thanks for watching. Bye now.